Why did they doubt her? Why, in every room she entered, did silence stretch a fraction longer when her name was called? She sat at the edge of her cot, boots unlaced, fingers tracing the worn leather as if memorizing each crease. Outside, the generator droned a low and steady hum, the kind of sound that numbed the nerves after weeks of repetition. Soldiers passed outside the thin walls of canvas, their voices muted, clipped, alive with anticipation, and the kind of edge only a mission briefing brings. Her breath fogged faintly in the cool air. The tent smelled of dust, sweat, and oil, the scent of waiting. She stared at her hands, steady, scarred by small marks of training. They were not the hands of someone fragile, but still the whispers followed her like shadows. They said she wouldn't last. She had heard it in barracks corridors, in classrooms, in training ranges where instructors thought she was too far to notice. She caught it in the side glances of her teammates, the measured tones of commanders reading her file. Too fragile, too quiet, the kind of soldier who faded instead of endured. What they didn't know, what no one here knew, was that she had already outlasted storms far greater than war. The radio crackled sharp against the tense silence, pulling her back. Briefing in 5. Her boots snapped against the ground as she laced them tight. She rose with deliberate movement, the weight of routine falling into place like armor. Step by step, she crossed the outpost, past lines of mud-caked boots, the low whistle of men preparing themselves, the smell of instant coffee rising in the air. When she pushed into the command tent, heads turned. Conversations dimmed, not hostile, just doubtful. It was the kind of silence she had learned to live inside. The kind where judgments were spoken not with words, but with looks that lingered too long. Her eyes ignored them, fixing instead on the map stretched across the board. A valley, a ridge, a red circle marking an enemy compound buried deep within rock and ruin. The operation was simple on paper, a high-value extraction, the kind of mission they all knew too well, dangerous, surgical, unforgiving. The path was narrow, the enemy entrenched. Backup would not reach them in time if things went wrong. And yet her name was there, on the roster, on the line. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. But as she stood in that crowded room, surrounded by voices that measured and doubted, a single thought surfaced and refused to leave. Why her, why now? The commander's voice cut through the static. Calm, direct. The mission laid out in firm detail. The team would move by dawn, drop by helicopter into the ridge. From there they would push through terrain too jagged for vehicles, navigate through choke points likely watched by enemy eyes, and reach the extraction target. One mistake could unravel it all. Her role: Overwatch. Sniper. Eyes from above. It was not the kind of job given by chance. It was trust, heavy and unspoken. And still, the silence in the room weighed heavier than the rifle she carried. She felt it in her chest, the quiet press of doubt that wasn't hers but theirs. And yet there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. That night, long after the maps were rolled away and orders finalized, she lay awake on her cot. The storm outside clawed at the canvas walls, rain hammering against the ground in relentless rhythm. Lightning split the horizon, turning shadows into ghosts for fractions of a second. Her chest tightened, not from fear of the mission, not from the thought of combat, but from memory. Another storm, another lifetime. She could see it still, years ago, a kitchen that smelled of stale coffee and smoke. Her father's voice sharp as broken glass, his words etched deep. You'll never stand through anything hard. You're not built for it. The slam of a door, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but absolute, final. That was the first storm she survived. The night she swore that storms would never define her, that she would endure longer than the thunder, longer than the voices that broke her down. Now, as the storm raged over this outpost, she whispered that vow again, words carried only to herself. I'll last. The dawn broke with the sound of blades tearing air apart. Helicopter rotors thundered overhead, kicking dust and grit across the landing zone. The team moved quick, gear strapped tight, eyes hidden behind tinted goggles. She climbed aboard, the rifle secure across her chest, the metal vibrating under her fingers as the bird lifted. The world tilted, ground shrinking to lines of earth and stone. The roar of the rotors filled every space where silence once lived. She scanned the faces around her. Each carried something different: quiet, fear, resolve. Ramirez sat across from her, his gear worn, his shoulders heavy with years of missions. He adjusted something near his vest, and for a moment she caught the corner of a photograph. A girl, maybe 6, bright smile, pigtails, a daughter. He noticed her eyes and gave a small, tired grin. "She thinks I'm a superhero." His voice was almost lost beneath the roar. Then softer, barely audible, "Don't tell her the truth." She wanted to answer, to tell him the truth was far greater than capes or masks. That being here in this machine on this mission was more than heroism, it was sacrifice. But the helicopter drowned the words before they reached her lips. She looked back down at her hands, steady on the rifle. Her silence was answer enough. The helicopter surged forward, carrying them toward the ridge, toward the storm of another kind. The mission had begun. The ridge rose ahead like a wall of shadow, jagged and unforgiving. The helicopter dropped low, blades cutting through thin air, dust exploding in violent clouds. Boots slammed earth as one by one, the team hit the ground. Then silence. The helicopter peeled away, its thunder fatting until only the mountain wind remained. The earth beneath her boots was harsh, layered with gravel and broken stone. The air smelled of iron and pine. She adjusted the rifle across her back, eyes scanning the jagged paths ahead. This was her place now, Overwatch. The ridge was not forgiving. Paths twisted, cliffs cut sharp. Every step forward risked a shadow above. The team moved slow, deliberate, their breaths controlled, their gear heavy against the climb. Halfway through it began. Not sudden, not loud. Just distant. The sharp crack of gunfire, rolling like thunder from higher ground. The team dove, boots skidding, backs against stone. Her rifle was already in her hands, cheek pressed to stock, scope aligned with instinct more than thought. Breath slowed. Heart steady. One target, their shadow against rock. Trigger squeezed. The shot broke the air, clean, final. Silence returned as quickly as it had shattered. The enemy was down, the team still alive. Yet she knew this wasn't an attempt to kill, not yet. It was a reminder. A whisper from the ridge. "We're waiting." Her eyes lingered through the scope long after the team moved again. Every shadow seemed heavier. Every gust of wind carried voices she could almost hear. The ridge was alive, watching, testing. But she didn't falter. She had promised herself long ago that storms could scream, winds could rage, and doubt could whisper. But she would stand. She had outlasted storms before. She would again. And as the team pressed deeper into the canyon, she carried that vow with her, unshaken, unbroken, the silence of her resolve louder than any gunfire could ever be. The storm had passed, but its echo clung to the ridges, rolling in low rumbles across the valley. The earth was damp, the air heavy, every step sinking slightly into mud. The team pushed forward, boots grinding stone, eyes sharp against the cliffs above. She kept to the rear, rifle slung but ready, every sense stretched thin. The ridge was not quiet, it breathed. Pebbles shifted. Wind whistled in uneven tones. Somewhere, water dripped, steady as a metronome. The mountain itself seemed alive, as though holding its breath, waiting. The sun fought to cut through clouds, streaks of pale light sliding across the canyon. Visibility was broken, perfect terrain for ambushes, perfect cover for anyone waiting to test their patience. Ramirez muttered under his breath, voice low, "Feels wrong, too still." Collins, the youngest, adjusted his pack nervously. His eyes darted to every shadow, every bend. He had energy, but it was restless, raw. "What's the point of Overwatch?" he asked, "when the whole damn mountain's watching us?" She didn't answer, not yet. Because she knew something about silence that he didn't. Silence wasn't emptiness. It was weight. And sometimes silence meant the storm hadn't finished. Hours stretched. The climb pulled at every muscle, sweat running under armor, hands scraped raw on stone. The ridge narrowed, forcing them single file. At one point, Ramirez nearly lost footing, his boots skidding on wet rock. She reached out instinctively, steadying him. He gave a quick nod of thanks, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. She noticed everything. The way Collins carried himself too stiffly, trying to mimic confidence but giving away his fear in the twitch of his jaw. The way Ramirez rubbed his shoulder when he thought no one noticed, old injury flaring with each climb. The way the point man, Sergeant Hale, kept glancing at his watch as though time itself were the enemy. And through it all, she kept her silence. Not because she had nothing to say, but because words felt heavy here, too easily stolen by the wind. They reached a hollow by dusk, a natural alcove carved into the ridge wall. Shelter, not much but enough. They set down packs, split rations, checked weapons. The air grew colder, every exhale a puff of white in the fading light. She sat near the entrance, rifle across her lap, eyes scanning the horizon. The sun bled into the valley, painting stone and shadow in muted reds. Behind her, voices rose in quiet fragments. Collins tried to eat but barely touched his ration. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it. Finally, he looked up. "What if we don't make it?" His tone was too sharp, his youth laid bare. Ramirez leaned back against stone, chewing slowly. "Then we don't." His voice was tired but not cruel. "But we don't get to ask that question now." Collins stared at him, face pale in the dim light. "You've done this before, right? You've lasted." Ramirez's gaze softened just slightly. He pulled the photo from his vest, holding it out. His daughter's face smiled in the fading glow. "She's the reason I keep going. Every ridge, every storm, every bullet. Not for me, for her." Silence followed. Collins swallowed hard, staring into the fire they had built small and low. She wanted to speak, to tell them both what storms she had carried, what weight she bore. But the words stuck, locked behind walls she wasn't ready to lower. Instead, she kept her watch, listening to every crack in the dark. Because she knew, fear never announced itself with gunfire first. It whispered in quiet places, long before the shot was fired. Night settled thick. The fire burned low, embers glowing faint. The team tried to rest, but sleep was thin. Collins shifted constantly, muttering, his dreams fractured. Ramirez snored lightly, one arm curled against his rifle. Hale sat with his back against the wall, eyes half closed, hand always near his sidearm. She stayed awake. Every sound mattered now. A pebble sliding down a slope, the creak of leather, the distant cough of wind pushing through narrow rock. She counted the seconds between each sound, trained to hear patterns where none should exist. And then, a new sound. Barely audible. Not stone, not wind. A step. She froze, breath caught in her chest. Slowly she raised the rifle, scope glinting faintly in the ember light. Her eyes scanned the ridge line above. Shadows thick, impossible to separate from one another. But their movement, subtle, watching. She didn't fire. Not yet. Because it wasn't a strike, it was something worse. They were being measured. By dawn, her eyes burned from sleeplessness. The storm had moved on, but its ghost lingered in her bones. They broke camp with quiet efficiency, moving again through the ridge. The air was crisper now, the light sharper. Every detail stood out in harsh relief. The way frost clung to rock, the thin white line of clouds above, the smell of damp soil as the sun warmed it. But beneath it all, there was a hum, a feeling, as if every step forward drew them deeper into something unseen. Collins stumbled once, nearly dropping his rifle. She steadied him quickly, her hand gripping his arm. He looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "I don't want to be the weak link," he whispered. "You're not," she said simply. It was the first time she had spoken since dawn. And it surprised even her, how much those words mattered, not just to him but to herself. Because once, long ago, she had been told she was the weak link, that storms would break her, that she would never stand through anything hard. But here she was, still standing. And so was he. The path ahead tightened again, cliffs closing in, walls pressing. Perfect ground for an ambush. Hale raised a fist signaling halt. The team crouched low, weapons ready. She slid into position, scope scanning the jagged heights. The air was still, unnaturally so. Minutes passed, nothing. Then, gunfire. Not from the front, not from the obvious angles, but from behind. Echoes cracked through the canyon, sharp and deliberate. Bullets sparked against stone. Dust exploded around them. The team scrambled for cover, shouts mixing with the thunder of rifles. Her cheek pressed to the stock, scope rising, vision narrowing. She found the muzzle flash, traced it back to a shadow high above. Breath. Steady. Trigger. The shot rang out, slicing silence apart. The enemy dropped, tumbling lifeless against the stone. For a moment, only the wind remained. Then Ramirez whispered, his voice shaking but alive. "Thanks." Just one word, heavy. But behind it was the truth. This wasn't over. The ridge wasn't letting them go. They moved again, faster now, every nerve alive. Shadows lengthened as the sun shifted, light fractured by jagged cliffs. Her shoulders ached, her eyes stung, but her steps didn't falter. She had lasted through the night. Through storms. Through silence that tested every part of her. And she knew this was only the beginning. What kept her moving when everything around her whispered to stop? The path narrowed again, cutting like a scar along the mountainside. One wrong step and the valley yawned open below, a fall into silence that would end everything in a heartbeat. Wind tore across the cliff face, sharp and bitter, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of dust. The team moved in single file, each step deliberate. She took the rear again, her rifle cradled against her chest, scope tilted downward to catch any flicker of movement in the shadows below. Every nerve hummed with awareness. The ridge was alive, and she knew it. Hale led them forward, his voice a low growl through the comms. Eyes sharp, don't trust the quiet. They didn't need reminding. The quiet here wasn't safety, it was a trap. And yet, even as she scanned the rocks and shadows, her thoughts turned inward, unbidden. She remembered another cliff, another narrow path years before, not in uniform, not on mission. A hike she had taken with someone who had once meant everything. Her sister. The memory burned bright for a moment, laughter echoing through canyons, sunlight on their shoulders, the world so wide and free that nothing seemed heavy. But then came the storm that swallowed her sister's laughter, the storm that left her alone. She blinked it away, forcing her focus back to the ridge. Memory had no place here, not when lives hung on her eyes and her steadiness. The team pressed on for hours. The climb grew harsher, sharper, every incline dragging sweat down their backs and grit into their lungs. Twice they stopped for water, their breaths heavy, the silence between them filled only by the scrape of boots and the low sigh of wind. Ramirez walked beside her for a stretch, his voice quiet enough only she could hear. "You don't talk much." She didn't answer at first. Silence was easier, but his tone wasn't mocking, it was searching. Finally, she said, "Talking doesn't keep anyone alive." He chuckled softly, a sound too tired to be joy. "Fair, but it helps sometimes." He tapped the pocket where the photo of his daughter rested. "She'd tell me stories every night, about school, about the dog, about little things, kept me steady, reminded me why I was out here." She glanced at him, her face unreadable. "And now?" He looked away, scanning the ridge ahead. His voice dropped. Now I just try to make it back to hear the next story. The words lingered in her chest long after he moved ahead. By late afternoon, the sun fell behind clouds, dragging shadow across the ridge. Visibility thinned. Collins stumbled more often, exhaustion carving lines into his young face. Hale's orders grew sharper, clipped with the weight of knowing time was against them. Then it came again. Gunfire. Not distant this time, close. Too close. The canyon erupted in cracks and ricochets, stone shattering under impact. The team scattered to cover, backs pressed to jagged rock. Dust exploded in clouds, choking lungs, blinding eyes. She slid down behind a boulder, rifle snapping into position. Her scope cut through the haze, hunting for the source. A glint, a shadow, a muzzle flash sparking just long enough to betray its owner. Her breath slowed. Her finger tightened. The shot rang out clean, precise, one down. But more came. From above, from behind, from places impossible to reach without days of preparation. Which meant only one thing. They'd been expected. Hale's voice snapped through comms. Push forward, they want us pinned, we break the line now. Ramirez fired bursts to cover Collins as he scrambled toward the next outcropping. She shifted her scope, hunting shadows, her shots slicing through the chaos with surgical rhythm. 1, 2, 3. Each breath was measured, each squeeze deliberate. And yet the enemy pressed harder, their confidence clear. She could feel it in her bones. They weren't just trying to stop the mission. They were trying to break her. The fight lasted minutes, though it stretched like hours. Finally, the gunfire eased. Silence reclaimed the ridge, heavy and thick, broken only by ragged breaths. Collins leaned against the rock, his face pale, hands trembling around his rifle. They knew we were coming. Ramirez wiped dust from his brow, eyes scanning the cliffside. Someone gave them our path. Hale's jaw clenched. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than any answer. She lowered her rifle slowly, the weight of the moment pressing into her chest. There was something she hadn't told them. Not about this mission, not about orders, but about why she was here at all. Why she volunteered for the role no one else wanted. Why she chose silence over explanation. Because this ridge, this valley, this mission, it wasn't just war for her. It was personal. They moved again, faster now, urgency etched into every step. The ridge narrowed into a choke point, cliffs rising like jagged teeth. Perfect place for another trap. Hale raised a fist. Hold. They crouched low, breath sharp in the thin air. The wind cut across the stone, howling like a warning. She scanned the heights, scope steady, every nerve alive. Nothing. And then, from the corner of her eye, movement. Not enemy. A child. Barely visible, half hidden behind rock. Thin arms, wide eyes, dirt smeared across a small face, watching them. Her chest tightened. Not from fear, not from surprise, but from memory. Her sister again, younger, smaller, eyes filled not with fear but with trust. She blinked hard, pulling herself back. This wasn't her sister, this wasn't the past. But the child was real. And the child wasn't alone. Because behind him, shadows moved. The ambush broke like thunder. Figures spilled from the rocks, weapons flashing, shouts echoing across the canyon. The child vanished into the chaos, swallowed by bodies and dust. Gunfire erupted. The team scattered, firing, shouting, clawing for survival. She dropped to prone, rifle locking into her shoulder. The world narrowed to scope and target, every heartbeat a countdown. Shots cracked, bodies fell. Dust burned her throat, her ears rang with the thunder of conflict. Through it all, one thought anchored her. Not survival. Not orders. But promise. The promise she made long ago, in the silence of storms. when the world told her she would never last. She would. Longer than fear. Longer than storms. Even longer than death. When the smoke cleared, when silence reclaimed the ridge once more, the team stood, bloodied, breathless, but alive. Hale's voice rasped, his face streaked with dirt. "We keep moving." Ramirez adjusted his pack, wincing at the weight. Collins nodded shakily, his face still pale but his hands steadier than before. "And her?" She reloaded with calm precision, eyes scanning the horizon. Because she knew the truth. The ridge wasn't done. Not yet. And neither was she. Why was the night so quiet? That thought gnawed at her as she crouched against the fractured wall of what used to be a family's home. The silence wasn't peace, it was the wait before something snapped. She could feel it in the way the air pressed against her skin, in how her pulse raced with every second that passed. Somewhere beyond the broken windows and half-collapsed roof, men were moving, trained, watching, waiting for her to slip. She adjusted the strap of her rifle, careful not to let the metal scrape stone. Her gloves were damp from sweat, though the air was cold. She hated that cold outside, fire inside. Her heart refused to calm. It wasn't fear exactly. It was readiness. The kind of sharp focus that told her she wasn't safe, not yet. Her team was 100 yards back, behind the ruins of a schoolhouse. They thought she was just forward scouting, but she knew she was bait. The enemy had been circling them for hours, probing their defenses, cutting off the roads behind them. And she was the only one willing to walk into the shadows to draw them closer. Why her? Because she'd volunteered before anyone else could. Because if someone was going to be the decoy, she'd rather it be her than a man with kids waiting at home. Still, she hadn't told them everything. There was a reason she kept stepping forward mission after mission, almost reckless in her willingness to go where others hesitated. A promise. A memory. A faint crunch echoed down the alley. She froze, eyes narrowing, ears straining against the silence. The sound didn't repeat. A rat? No, too heavy, too careful. Her breath caught and she felt her muscles coil like springs. Whoever it was, they knew how to move. She pressed her cheek against the stock of her rifle, sights fixed on the jagged doorway at the alley's end. But she didn't fire. Not yet. Timing mattered more than nerves. She waited. Seconds dragged like minutes. Then a shadow slipped across the light of the half-moon. Broad shoulders, a flash of metal. Another figure followed, two, maybe three. They weren't rushing. They were searching. She could hear the faint click of their boots against rubble, deliberate, controlled, not amateurs. Her lips parted as her lungs begged her to breathe, but she kept still, lowering her pulse until it matched the silence. This was what training was for. This moment, when patience was more lethal than any bullet. When the first man stepped into the doorway, his silhouette filling the frame, she almost squeezed the trigger. But something in her stopped. She caught sight of a detail, the tilt of his head, the way his weapon lowered for just a fraction of a second, as if listening. She didn't fire, not yet. Because what if she was wrong? What if she pulled too soon? That hesitation dug into her. She had been here before, on another night in another country, when hesitation had cost someone everything. She'd sworn never to let it happen again. But here she was, holding her breath, refusing to act. The second man stepped out. The third followed. Now they were exposed, moonlight hitting the edge of their faces, their eyes scanning the ruins. They were hunters, but they hadn't found her yet. She steadied herself, finger pressing, the weight of choice heavy against her chest. And then a voice cut across the radio in her ear, soft, controlled, but urgent. "Contact left, they see you." Her chest clenched, which meant they weren't alone. These three were the distraction. Somewhere else, another set of eyes had spotted her. She shifted instantly, rolling across the dirt floor of the ruin, just as a spray of gunfire ripped through the wall she'd been leaning on. Splinters and shards of stone exploded, raining dust across her face. She didn't think, she moved. Up, forward, rifle snapping to shoulder. The first man in the doorway stumbled as her round cracked through the night, dropping him where he stood. The others dove for cover, shouts in a language she didn't need to understand. Her blood hammered in her ears. She fired again, a second figure collapsing into the rubble. But the third was smart. He didn't try to shoot back. He waited. That was the danger. Waiting meant he had a plan. She slid across the floor, heart pounding, mind racing. She thought of her team just yards away, not knowing how close the net had closed. If she didn't hold them here, even for a few minutes, the entire squad would be swallowed. And then amid the chaos she heard it: laughter. Not loud, not careless, just a faint, sharp laugh cutting through the night from the man who remained. It froze her more than the bullets had. Who laughs in a moment like this? She pressed her back to the wall, jaw tight. Something in her gut told her this wasn't over. That laugh meant he knew something she didn't, and she hated not knowing. Her finger twitched against the trigger, but she didn't fire blind. No wasted rounds, no panic. She listened, every sense burning alive. Then it hit her: silence again. Complete. He was gone, or worse, moving. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe, forcing herself to think past the noise in her head. Because she wasn't fighting just to survive. This wasn't about pride or proving herself. This was about keeping them alive, every one of them. And that laugh, that shadow still somewhere in the ruins, was going to test just how far she was willing to go. She whispered under her breath, not for anyone else to hear, only for herself. Not tonight, not again. Her own voice steadied her, and she moved, slow, precise, into the dark where the enemy had vanished. But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. Who fired the first shot? That was the question echoing in her mind as the night erupted into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the ruins like lightning, deafening bursts tearing apart the fragile silence she had been clinging to. The air smelled of gunpowder, sharp and bitter, mixing with the dust kicked up by each impact. She pressed herself flat against the rubble, rifle tight against her shoulder, eyes scanning for shadows that moved differently than the flickering light. Every breath burned in her throat, the weight of choice pressing on her chest like a stone. Shoot too soon and she'd give herself away. Wait too long and one of them would. Her radio crackled with voices from the squad behind her, panicked, clipped, overlapping. Where the fire coming from? We're blind out here. Do you have eyes? She didn't answer. Words would only slow her down. What mattered was seeing. What mattered was surviving long enough to make sure they did. Her scope caught the briefest outline of a figure ducking behind a crumbling wall. She squeezed the trigger. The crack echoed and the shadow dropped. No time to confirm. She shifted left, another silhouette emerging, moving fast. Another shot. Another fall. But for everyone she took down, another voice shouted, another flash of gunfire came back at her. They weren't disorganized. They were disciplined, patient. The kind of men who didn't just stumble across soldiers in the night, they hunted them. Her stomach tightened as the thought struck her. This wasn't random. They knew who they were after. And then the memory surged again, uninvited, a different night, a different place. A convoy ambushed, flames in the dark. Her best friend's voice screaming over the radio, cut off too soon. She had lived, he hadn't. And she had sworn through clenched teeth and broken ribs, never again. Never. That's why she pushed forward now, heart pounding, lungs aching. Because if the enemy wanted her squad, they'd have to go through her first. She slid across the rubble, glass crunching under her boots. The sound was too loud, too sharp, and immediately gunfire answered, sparks spraying inches from her head. She gritted her teeth, rolled, and fired back blind, just enough to make them duck. Her hands shook, not from fear but from the raw energy burning through her veins. And then she heard it again, that laugh. It wasn't close this time. It was moving, following her. Her throat went dry. He wasn't trying to kill her quickly. He was enjoying this, drawing it out. Why? She swallowed hard, pressing herself into the shadow of a collapsed beam. Sweat rolled down her neck, cold against her skin. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, but another voice inside, the stubborn one, the one that had carried her this far, told her she couldn't. She had to face him. "Where are you?" she whispered into the dark. Her voice was barely audible even to herself. "Silence." And then behind her a whisper, not in her language, low, taunting. She spun, rifle raised, but the space was empty. Only shadows, only dust. Her hands trembled now, not from weakness, but from the realization that he was closer than she wanted to admit, hunting her like prey. She steadied herself, closed her eyes for half a second. She thought of her brother, the reason she had enlisted, the reason she had fought through every failure, every insult, every night where the weight of being the only woman crushed her. He had always believed in her, believed she had something no one else did. Strength that didn't shout, did demand, it endured. And she clung to that thought as she opened her eyes, finger firm on the trigger, body crouched and ready. The gunfire around the ruins was thinning now. The squad behind her had found their footing, returning fire with sharp, controlled bursts. She could hear the shift in rhythm, less panic, more precision. They would hold. They had to. Her fight wasn't back there. It was here in the dark with the man who laughed. A stone shifted near the far wall. She snapped toward it, rifle sights lined up. Breath slow, heart steady. And then she saw him. Not just a shadow this time. His face caught the edge of the moonlight, sharp features, a cruel smile. He didn't raise his weapon immediately. He just looked at her, as if studying, as if trying to understand why she was still standing when others would have fallen. Her stomach knotted. This wasn't just another soldier. This was someone who wanted her broken. She aimed, he smiled wider. And in that frozen second she understood. This was personal, not for him, for her. Because everything she had been running from, every failure, every memory, every night she thought she couldn't take another step, it was standing in front of her now, wearing a human face. The air between them was heavy, thick with smoke, silence, and something unspoken. Her finger tightened. And then, the radio crackled again. "We're pushing forward, cover us." Her eyes flicked toward the sound, just for a second. When she looked back, he was gone. Her breath caught. Gone. But the laugh lingered, echoing in her head. And for the first time tonight, she felt something worse than fear. Doubt. What did it mean to fight an enemy you couldn't see? That question circled in her mind as she moved deeper into the ruins, boots brushing against shattered glass, rifle raised but steady. The gunfire behind her had faded into the distance, muffled cracks and shouts like echoes of a storm rolling away. Her squad was holding. They had to. But here in this broken maze of walls and shadows, it was just her and him, the one who laughed. She hated how quiet he was, not careless, not clumsy, silent in a way that felt deliberate, predatory. Every corner she rounded, she expected him there, waiting. Every step felt like it might be her last, and yet she kept moving forward, drawn by something she couldn't explain. Maybe anger, maybe pride, maybe the promise she had made to herself that she would never run again. Her breath fogged in the cold night air, dissolving into nothing. The moonlight stretched across the broken concrete, painting long black shadows. She crouched near a doorframe, pausing, listening. Then a sound, barely a shift, a heel against loose stone. Her heart stilled. She swung her rifle toward the sound, pulse quickening, but there was nothing. Only the faint sway of a curtain in the wind. Empty space. She swallowed hard. He was toying with her, drawing her deeper. For a moment her resolve wavered. She thought about retreating, pulling back to the others. Was it foolish to chase a ghost through ruins? To risk herself for the satisfaction of a fight she didn't even know she could win? But then the memory struck again. The convoy. The smoke. Her friend's voice cut off mid-sentence. The helpless rage of surviving when someone else didn't. No, she couldn't turn back. She edged forward, one step at a time, careful with her weight, rifle tucked close. Every instinct told her she was being watched. And then she heard it, not laughter this time, A voice, low, calm, almost conversational. "You don't belong here." The words froze her blood, not because of the threat but because they were spoken in her language, clear, precise, without accent. Her mind reeled. Who was he? How did he know? She steadied her voice, though her throat felt dry. "Show yourself." Silence. Her hands tightened around the grip. Sweat slid down her back despite the chill. She hated how he had found a way to crawl under her skin with only 4 words. He wasn't just a fighter. He was inside her head now, and that was more dangerous than any weapon. She moved again, faster now, anger replacing fear. If he wanted her broken, he'd have to do it face to face. The ruins narrowed into a long corridor, bricks caving inward, moonlight barely reaching. She moved through it, boots crunching quietly on dust. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to stop, but she pressed on. Halfway through, she heard it again, that laugh, this time right behind her. She spun, rifle snapping up nothing, only the darkness she had just walked through. Her breathing turned sharp, jagged. Was she chasing him, or was he leading her? And then movement. At the far end of the corridor, a shadow stepping into the faint light. It was him. For a moment they stared at each other across the narrow space. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes glimmered with something she hated instantly, certainty. As if he had already decided how this would end. She raised her rifle, sight locking on his chest. But before she could fire, he raised a hand. Not a weapon, just a hand, open, as if inviting her to try. Her jaw clenched. She squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked, echoing like thunder through the ruins. And yet he didn't fall. Her stomach dropped. She had hit him. She knew she had. The recoil, the line, the sound. But he only staggered, then straightened again, his hand lowering, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Her breath caught, body armor heavy, reinforced. He stepped closer. Her mind raced. She could fire again, but panic clouded her aim. What if it wouldn't matter? What if every shot only fed his confidence? Her legs wanted to run, but her pride anchored her to the ground. And then she heard voices over the radio again. Her squad calling for her. "We're advancing, need cover." Her eyes flicked toward the sound, just for a heartbeat. When she looked back, he was gone. Her chest tightened. She lowered her rifle slowly, the echo of her shot still ringing in her ears. He wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And neither was she. Because if he thought she would break tonight, he hadn't seen storms, fear, or death try to take her before. She had survived them all. What did it mean when a voice lingered long after the man had vanished? That was the thought burning through her as she sprinted back toward the squad's position, heart hammering, lungs tearing at the cold night air. The ruins behind her seemed alive now, every shadow twisting, every echo a reminder that he was still there, watching, waiting. The squad came into view. Shapes hunched behind broken walls, faces lit by the faint glow of muzzle flashes. They weren't panicked anymore. They were fighting, methodical and sharp, but they were pinned. Every time they tried to advance, gunfire stitched the ground in front of them, forcing them down. She dropped beside the sergeant, who looked up at her with a mix of relief and anger. "Where the hell have you been?" His voice was raw, strained from shouting. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes scanned the field ahead. Dark alleys, shattered cars, and overturned trucks serving as cover for the enemy. They had the high ground and sightlines across the entire street. The squad didn't stand a chance if they stayed here. "We're boxed in," another soldier muttered, his face pale. He couldn't have been more than 22, too young to have eyes that tired. "They'll close in soon." Her throat tightened. She knew he was right. She forced herself to breathe slowly. Think, this was where hesitation killed. But her hands were trembling again. The image of the laughing man burned into her mind. His voice, his calm certainty. "You don't belong here." It had cut deeper than a bullet, dragging out all the doubts she had buried under years of training. For a moment she felt it, the weight of all those who had told her the same. The academy instructors who smirked when she stepped onto the range. The officers who doubted her stamina, her grit. Even her own father once when he told her war wasn't for women, that her brother was built for it, not her. And yet she was here, leading, surviving, carrying others forward when no one thought she could. Her radio crackled again. Command's voice, sharp, urgent, "Push through or you won't make extraction. Move now." The sergeant cursed, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. "They'll tear us apart if we move." Her jaw tightened. Maybe he was right, but standing still was death too. She looked at the young soldier beside her, his hands shaking as he loaded his weapon. She thought about her brother, about the convoy, about every promise she had made to ghosts who would never hear her again. Her voice came out low, steady. "I'll draw their fire." The sergeant snapped his head toward her. "No, absolutely not." But she was already moving, heart pounding, blood roaring in her ears. She didn't wait for permission. She never had. She broke from cover, sprinting across open ground, bullets snapping past her like angry bees. The air filled with cracks and flashes, sparks spitting off the pavement near her boots. She dove behind a half-collapsed wall, rolled, and came up firing. Her rounds hammered the overturned truck, forcing the enemy to duck. Shouts rose in the dark, chaotic, panicked for the first time. And in that chaos her squad surged forward. She heard their boots pounding, their voices shouting, their rifles cracking in rhythm. They were moving, alive. Her chest heaved, every breath burning. She fired again, the recoil rattling through her bones, her shoulder aching. She didn't stop, couldn't, because every second she kept the enemy's eyes on her was another second her squad survived. Then silence. The gunfire from the truck faltered. She frowned, adjusting her sights. Empty. The truck was abandoned. Her stomach dropped. Too late she realized the truth. They hadn't been firing to stop her squad. They had been hurting them, pushing them forward. And standing in the street ahead, barely visible in the moonlight, was him. The laughing man. He didn't raise his weapon. Didn't need to. His presence alone froze the squad mid-step. Her blood turned to ice. She had led them straight into him. The sergeant shouted, "Fall back, fall." A shot cracked, silencing him. He dropped where he stood. The squad erupted into panic, some firing wildly, others dragging the sergeant's body back. The young soldier she had spoken to earlier froze, staring at her, eyes wide with terror. And then she heard it again, that laugh, low, sharp, carving through the chaos like a blade. Her throat burned as guilt clawed at her chest. She had promised herself never again, never to lead someone into death because of her choices, and yet here it was. Her hands tightened on her rifle, rage trembling through her arms. This ended tonight, even if it killed her. The desert air was still when the last echoes of battle faded, as though the earth itself exhaled relief after holding its breath for too long. Smoke trailed upward in fragile ribbons, carrying with it the memories of the fight that had tested every ounce of human endurance. For Alina, standing on the ridge with the weight of her flight suit and the burn of exhaustion in her lungs, the silence was almost unbearable. Victory never felt as clean as the reports would later claim. She stared at the horizon where the sun bled orange into the pale sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the shimmer of heat, lay 1,000 graves no one would mark with names. In war, even when you won, something sacred was always lost. A radio crackled at her hip. The voice of the base commander came through, rough but steady. "Valkyrie confirmed status. Mission objective completed. We're bringing you home." Home? The word tasted foreign, like something she had heard once in childhood but forgotten through years of dust, flight, and orders. Her eyes narrowed. Coming home meant more than crossing the desert. It meant walking back into a world that had chosen to forget her, a world where women like her had been expected to fade quietly into the background. Yet here she was standing alive, her name whispered across the ranks like a warning, like a prayer. She pressed the radio. Valkyrie copies, returning. But she didn't turn back right away. She stood at the edge of the cliff, feeling the weight of everything that had come before. Her childhood watching the contrails of jets across the Austrian skis, her first solo flight where fear and freedom had fused into one, the years of silence when she buried her past, and now this. A mission no one thought she could carry, yet one only she could finish. The base was alive with movement when she returned. Trucks rolled across the sand, soldiers moved in synchronized patterns, and medics tended to the wounded in makeshift tents. Yet when Alina climbed out of her F-22, every head turned toward her. Not because she was the only woman among them, not because she carried the call sign of a myth, but because they knew, without her, none of them would be standing here at all. The mechanic who had doubted her on the first day lowered his gaze in shame. A medic she had helped drag out of crossfire raised a trembling hand in salute. And in the crowd, the young pilot who had once asked her, "Do you really belong here?" now watched with wide eyes that carried an answer. Alina walked past them without a word. Her boots pressed into the sand, heavy and deliberate, each step echoing the truth that didn't need to be spoken aloud. She had proven it. Not for them, not for the record books, but for herself, for the girl who once dreamed under quiet skis, and for every woman who would one day put on the uniform and face the same doubts. Later in the command tent, the general leaned over the map table, his voice gravelly with wear. "You were supposed to cover the strike team. You ended up saving half the division. I don't know if you're reckless or brilliant, Captain." Alina met his stare, her tone even. "Sometimes survival doesn't care about the plan, sir." The general studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "History is going to remember this, whether you want it or not." But Alina didn't care for history. Records twisted, governments softened truths, and medals collected dust in forgotten drawers. What mattered was simpler, that the people she had fought alongside would carry the memory in their blood, in the way they looked at the sky, in the way they carried the fire forward. Still, when the general pushed a folder across the table, stamped with her name, her hands trembled. Inside was not just a commendation but something rarer, acknowledgement. An official line carved into the story of war that could never again erase her presence. That night sleep came reluctantly. She lay on her bunk, listening to the hum of generators outside, her body aching with 100 invisible bruises. Dreams brought her back to the cockpit, the scream of engines, the lock-on tone, the split-second choice that separated life from annihilation. She woke drenched in sweat, her breath sharp, her hands still clenched as though she gripped the controls. War never left cleanly. It tattooed itself into your nerves, into the rhythms of your heartbeat. She knew she would carry this one forever. Yet in the stillness, another memory surfaced. The face of a young girl at the edge of an airfield years ago, watching jets climb into the stratosphere. That girl had been Alina once, wide-eyed and unbroken. Tonight she realized something profound: she hadn't lost her. She had brought her here, carried her through fire and doubt, and proven that even when the world turned its back, she would rise. Days later, a plane carried her back to familiar soil. The mountains of home broke the horizon like guardians of memory. Reporters crowded the arrival point, their cameras flashing, their voices shouting questions she didn't want to answer. Politicians would use her story for speeches, the military for recruitment, and newspapers for headlines. But when Alina stepped onto the tarmac, her eyes searched for one thing and found it. Her mother stood at the edge of the crowd, hair grayer now, eyes tired but fierce. No cameras turned to her, no microphones reached, but her presence was louder than all of them. Alina walked straight into her arms, the strength of war dissolving into the fragility of a daughter. No medals could weigh as much as that embrace. Her mother whispered in her ear, "You didn't just come back, Alina, you came back whole." And for the first time, Alina believed it. In the weeks that followed, her story spread beyond borders. Some called her a symbol of courage. Others debated the morality of the mission. But in hangars and classrooms, in living rooms where little girls pointed at the television, her name carried something more powerful than politics: possibility. One evening, she returned to the airfield of her youth. The sky stretched wide, streaked with the contrails of modern jets training overhead. A group of cadets stood near the fence, their uniforms crisp, their laughter nervous. Among them was a girl with bright eyes who glanced at Alina's flight jacket and asked shyly, "Were you really in the F-22 that day?" Alina smiled softly, crouching to meet her gaze. "Yes, and one day it could be you." The girl's eyes widened, and for a fleeting second, Alina saw herself reflected there, the unbroken chain of dreamers who dared to rise against the weight of expectation. As the sun dipped low, Alina stood alone on the runway. Wind brushed against her face, carrying the scent of jet fuel and distant rain. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the noise of engines or the chatter of history, but to the silence between. A silence that carried meaning only she could hear. In it she heard the truth. War had not defined her, but it had revealed her. It had shown her the cost of courage, the loneliness of command, and the beauty of survival. And though the scars would remain, they were not shackles. They were proof she had lived, fought, and refused to vanish. Somewhere above, a jet roared into the heavens. Alina tilted her head, watching as it cut through the sky, leaving a trail that would fade but never truly disappear. Just like her story, just like her name. She whispered into the wind, almost to herself. The sky remembers. And she knew, so would the world.